Helen, welcome to the British History Podcast and channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are at Harvington Hall for the History Festival, which you're kicking off.
Apparently,
yes,
I'm very honoured.
Yeah, first talk of the festival of 2025. First of all, congratulations on your latest book, The Eagle and The Hart.
Thank you.
I've listened to it now, which of course you narrate on Audible twice. Honestly, it's so good, and of course it's looking at in detail into the relationship and the lives of Richard II, and Henry Bolingbroke, of course, becomes Henry IV when he usurps Richard. What drew you to that particular moment in English history?
I've been fascinated by these two for what is now more decades than I want to count. Ever since I started studying medieval history properly when I was an undergraduate in the late 1980s, I was taught by a very brilliant medievalist called Christine Carpenter, and she set an essay on Richard II, which I did really badly, but sitting with her, working out what I'd got wrong and why, I just became totally fascinated by this moment where you have Richard, who is rightfully king. He's the only son of the Black Prince, the sole heir, accepted heir of the great King Edward III. And he has a cousin, Henry, who's exactly the same age. They're both 10 when Richard becomes king. But 22 years later, Henry will depose Richard and take over in his place, and just trying to understand what had gone wrong with Richard's rule, because deposing a king was an enormous step to take, a very dangerous step, not one that anyone would take lightly in the Middle Ages. What had gone wrong with Richard's rule and why it was that Henry took over were questions that I've been grappling with ever since, and had such a fascinating time trying to get to grips with in the book.
Because it is a pivotal moment in English history, and it changes, I suppose, the outlook on monarchy and what is possible about who rules and how they come to that.
One of the fascinating things, I think, is that what Henry's trying to do is actually preserve the traditions and the accepted rules of the constitution and the way the king should relate to his subjects, because Richard has trampled across the accepted relationship between the king and the law, the king and property rights, the king and the rights of his subjects. So what Henry's trying to do is to preserve, to conserve the constitution as it was, but because he has to depose his cousin to do it, of course, he too is breaking rules, and particularly because he has a claim to the throne, but not the claim. He's not Richard's son, he's not Richard's brother, so he is deposing Richard and usurping the throne, but in the attempt to say that the old rules should still be in place. It's a very complex moment, yeah, and one that, as you say, does end up setting precedents for possible conflicts to come.
Yeah. So now Richard is often portrayed as an autocratic king, and in your book there is more to him than that, which was very interesting. I was actually really interested in the fact that he didn't put himself in the field of conflict, physical conflict. Mm-hmm. He seemed to avoid that at all costs, which is a stark contrast to his cousin Henry Bolingbroke.
And a real problem, because this period, the late 14th century, is one in which England and France are at war and have been at war for decades. It's the war that we know as the 100 Years' War. Of course, they didn't know it was going to be the 100 Years' War. They weren't saying, right, lads, it's half time.
Nice and tidy.
Let's have a break.
Yeah.
But Edward III had won huge victories in this war in the 1340s, the 1350s, and the war had almost entirely been fought on French soil. The problem for Richard is that all the momentum of the war is now going the other way. The coast of England itself is getting raided, England is being threatened with invasion, and Richard, as you say, has no interest in fighting. Now, personally, I might sympathise a lot, but you can't simply duck out of those responsibilities for the defence of the realm when you wear the crown. And what you certainly can't do is just treat it all as a tedious irrelevance, something you don't want to have to deal with. And that was the problem, that Richard was not interested in the war, tended to see the King of France as a fellow monarch who would understand him rather than England's long-term enemy. And that was one very, very important symptom of Richard's failure to understand that being king gave him responsibilities as well as rights. He was all about what his rights were as king and not seeing that he had duties to his subjects as a result of wearing the crown.
And where does that fundamental misunderstanding of what his role actually is as king, where did that come from? How is he so off mark?
Well, one of the interesting things when you start looking at Richard's upbringing is that he never gets a chance to see kingship in action, because from the time of his earliest memories, when he was 3 or 4, his father, the Black Prince, who was a great war hero, was chronically ill by that stage in the 1370s. And his grandfather, the King Edward III, was also ageing and ill. So he heard a lot about what it meant to be king, and in fact was being pushed forward as a small boy as the great hope of the nation, more or less in Parliament at the beginning of 1377, after his father had in fact died, and just 6 months before his grandfather would die, taken into Parliament and described as England's Messiah in front of the representatives of the realm. Now, they knew that that was political rhetoric, but the 10-year-old boy sitting there hearing himself described more or less as Christ didn't know it was rhetoric. And so I think he gets the wrong idea. He's wrapped in a sort of gilded cotton wool, told he's extremely special, but not actually pushed to learn the skills that he'll need to be an effective king.
He absorbs that idea.
He really does. Yeah.
So, because one of the striking themes about it that comes through in the book is this fragility of kingship itself. Because even Edward III, you say that, Richard is just hearing about how amazing his grandfather was. By sort of the end of his life, he's not this formidable character that he was. Is he taking a back seat and sort of getting Richard the right education, the right footing?
It's not at all clear that by the 1370s, which is when Richard's early education, his education before he becomes king, takes place, Edward III, his grandfather, really isn't in a state of health to take an active role either in government or in his grandson's education. And this is one of the problems, that Richard is his father's only legitimate child. So he's extremely precious. He is unique in that sense. Everyone is tiptoeing around how important it is to keep him safe, but no one is pushing him to learn, to go outside his comfort zone. And of course he becomes king at 10. How are you going to get the king to do his homework if he doesn't want to? It's very, very difficult. Meanwhile, his cousin Henry, who is being brought up as the heir to the great Duchy of Lancaster, his father is John of Gaunt, the most powerful nobleman in the country, one of the Black Prince's brothers. Henry is being pushed. He's being pushed to learn to fight. He's being pushed to learn intellectually, and he's being pushed to learn what it means to be a leader in peacetime as well as in war. And even though we can't see many of the details of their education, it is very clear that they're getting very different training.
So this is what makes Henry attractive, presumably, to the nobles of the land, when Richard, it feels like he's letting them down.
It's certainly the case that Henry is his role as heir to the Duchy of Lancaster means that he's one of the leading nobles who's going to have to take a position on what the king is and isn't doing. And we see that in the 1380s as Richard's rule, as he's beginning to get to an age where he should be taking over but isn't doing any of the things that the country needs. You see that Henry, who is the same age, is beginning to step forward as his father's heir, and particularly in the late 1380s when John of Gaunt goes to fight in Castile and leaves Henry in charge of the family's interests back at home in England, and Henry does step forward at that point. It's not that England is looking to someone else to take over, because the king is the king. He's God's anointed. You can't just go, well, this one isn't working, let's have somebody else. You have to get to a point of huge crisis before that becomes a question. But yes, certainly by the late 1390s, when Richard's rule has gone completely off the rails, and instead of the king being the greatest defender and protector of his people, the king has become the greatest threat to his people, then the fact that Henry has all the qualities that you would look for in a king apart from birthright, he is the one who steps forward to save England from Richard at that point.
And how quickly do people have doubts once Henry actually does take the throne?
It's very, very difficult for Henry, because in that moment where everyone's agreeing, yes, we have to get rid of Richard, he doesn't have to strike a blow. The whole country rallies to him. He doesn't have to fight a battle. Richard is deposed before, not before anyone knows what's happening. Everyone knows what's happening, but no one is going to fight for Richard at that point. But once Richard's gone, then the fact that Henry is a usurper becomes a central feature of politics, because if anybody has any grievances, if anyone has any resentments, if anyone thinks, well, I'm not getting enough out of this new regime, normally you would just say, well, the king is the king, what can I do? But in this case, well, is he really the king? Should he really be the king? Might someone else have a better claim? Actually, perhaps he isn't the legitimate king. Rebellion is an awful lot closer to the surface than it would be in any normal circumstances. And Henry has to fight against that difficulty throughout his reign. It's never simple.
I'm going to ask you one last question, because you are on stage shortly, but you've written really compellingly about women in power in your earlier work. I mean, She-Wolves is an absolute favourite of mine, the book and the TV series that you did. I went following all your steps afterwards. So did any women in this story sort of come out and maybe unexpectedly? And
very much so, because when you look at the outlines of this story of these two men, two cousins, two kings, it looks like a very male moment, because there aren't any women who are stepping forward. In fact, at the key point of crisis, Richard is married to a little girl, a French princess who was only 6 when he married her, and Henry's wife has died by this point and he hasn't yet remarried. So when I first looked, it felt very strange, because there weren't many women at the heart of the story. But of course, the minute you start looking in detail, an extraordinary array of women are there in the wings, behind the scenes, just behind the closed doors of a public life. From Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, an extraordinary woman who has an extraordinary career. Before she marries the Black Prince, she's his first cousin once removed. She's already been married twice, and in scandalous circumstances has been allowed to annul her marriage to her first husband in order to marry her second. So if she's known as the Virgin of Kent, we have to remember that that's sarcastic. But also then Henry's wife, Mary de Bohun, who gives him 6 children in very swift succession, and is clearly an extraordinarily cultured and interesting woman, but a homemaker. She doesn't want to be at court. She prefers to be at home with the children while Henry goes off gallivanting around Europe. Or Henry's second wife, another extraordinary woman, the Dowager Duchess of Brittany. Henry, it seems to me, not only loves women but likes them. He sees women as fully human, whereas, again, you couldn't make up how much these two men are contrasting characters. Richard really not interested in women at all. There are questions about quite what his sexuality might have been, but certainly the only person whose interests he ever took as seriously as his own was his favourite in the 1380s, a man called Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. And the fact that de Vere was defeated in battle by Henry and then exiled during a crisis of the 1380s was something that Richard never forgave. So there are very, very interesting things going on within and behind these political conflicts that take centre stage.
Thank you so much, Helen. And other than buying your book, which everyone should do, where else can they find you?
I am on Substack, which is a new thing for me, but I write a weekly post on Substack exploring hidden corners of this and other stories that I've told that didn't make it into the books or the TV programmes. So I would love it if anyone wants to come and join
the
me
H-Files?
there. The H-Files on Substack. I'm also on what used to be called Twitter and Instagram. So yes, please come and see me if you're on any of those platforms.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you for having me.